Coming up next on the Weekend Report, India quells the violence for a quiet farewell to Indira Gandhi. And in Poland, hundreds of thousands pray for a murdered priest who fought for solidarity. Plus, the president and Mondale on a last-ditch weekend campaign blitz. We'll take a close-up look at how the White House trying to win New York. A funeral for the victim of deadly force by city police. Plus, the Islanders on the ice and more cool weather.
Up to the minute Weekend Report, Channel 2 News with Vic Miles, Fred Wymore with sports, and Mr. G with the weather.
Good evening. An uneasy calm in India tonight after that nation said farewell to Indira Gandhi. The 66-year-old leader was assassinated earlier this week by security guards from the country's minority Sikh sect. As many as 1,000 people were reported killed in the sectarian violence that has erupted in that nation since Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. But today, India tried to put its fighting aside and pay final honors to the woman they called Mother India. CBS News correspondent Tom Fenton.
Today, under the guns of the Indian Army, with the threat of violence smoldering just beneath the surface. There were reports of scattered incidents and more evidence of the arson and bloodshed of the past 3 days. At the city morgue, Hindus stopped CBS News cameraman Derek Williams from taking pictures of 3 truckloads of bodies of Sikhs killed in the orgy of vengeance after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. The curfew was lifted just long enough for her state funeral. Under the circumstances, it was very low-key, despite the Army's efforts to make it a fitting tribute to a woman who has been a leading figure on the world stage for the past 18 years. Crowds were surprisingly thin on the funeral route along the Great Raj Path. Lack of transportation and fear of more violence kept many away. Displays of grief were relatively rare. The events of the past 3 days seemed to have drained people of emotions. Most just stared as the cortege passed. Close to 100 world leaders ran the risk of attending. They watched from an enclosure the Hindu rite of cremation. The assassinated prime minister's body was placed on a funeral platform and covered with a fragrant mixture of flowers, incense, and herbs. Rajiv Gandhi, the new prime minister, circled the body with a torch, touching his mother's head several times and finally lighting the funeral pyre. Army buglers sounded the last post. Mourners led by Rajiv Gandhi and his family added more incense and flowers and poured clarified butter on the flames, which Hindus believe will release her soul to heaven. The pyre will burn for 2 days. Having paid their last respects to Mrs. Gandhi, Indians now wonder whether her inexperienced son can lead the world's largest democracy in one of its darkest hours. Tom Fenton, CBS News, New Delhi.
And there's a death threat tonight against Rajiv Gandhi, India's new prime minister. The leader of a Sikh group in London is saying Gandhi will be killed like his mother unless he stops the slaughter of Sikhs in India. The leader also called for an apology for the storming of the Sikhs' holiest temple back in June. But other leaders of Sikh communities in England joined with Hindus to pray for Mrs. Gandhi today. In Poland, there was another huge funeral today. This one for the man now known around the world as Solidarity's priest. The irony, as CBS News correspondent John Chahan reports, is that his death is giving new life to the outlawed union.
Poland's Roman Catholic Church and Solidarity laid their martyred priest to rest before a crowd estimated at more than 250,000. It was the largest gathering of Solidarity sympathizers since the movement was crushed by the armed forces 3 years ago. The Solidarity priest, Father Jerzy Popiełuszko, was allegedly killed by a secret police death squad. He was interred on the grounds of his church at St. Stanisław's Parish in Warsaw. Father Popiełuszko preached against the government's use of force and against Soviet domination of Poland. Tens of thousands attended his monthly mass for the homeland because it gave them hope. Popiełuszko was harassed and repeatedly interrogated by the authorities. When the government pressure was heaviest, he was moved to tears by the support of his parish. At other times, he seemed faintly embarrassed by crowds chanting, "God bless you," outside his window. In the hearts of his own people, Father Popiełuszko is already canonized and is spoken of as the patron saint of Solidarity. That has significance in Poland because even determined rulers, they say, have a hard time fighting against saints. In his eulogy for his friend, Lech Wałęsa said, "We swear that this death will not be forgotten." The crowd responded, "We swear." Following the funeral, smaller groups demonstrated in the streets, chanting, "Where are the guilty ones?" Wałęsa's former deputy, Andrzej Gwiazda, recently released from prison, was tossed in the air by enthusiastic supporters. Solidarity, the movement the Polish government said was finished, had clearly started a new chapter at Father Popiełuszko's grave. John Sheehan, CBS News, Warsaw.
And in New York, about 300 people gathered outside the Polish consulate to express their feelings on Father Popiełuszko's death. But instead of tears and sorrow, this crowd was clearly angry, vowing that it would never happen again.
What they did a very bad thing, because killing Father Popiełuszko strengthened the people of Poland. They're united now, the more, because solidarity is dissolved, but now actually the bigger hatred against the Soviet Union.
Some of the protesters called on President Reagan to impose new economic sanctions against Poland. Police in Washington, D.C. today beefed up security at the United States Capitol on the eve of the 5th anniversary of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Trucks were set up as barricades at all 6 of the building's entrances. Sources told CBS News that pro-Iranian terrorists are almost desperate to strike an American target overseas between now and Election Day. D.C. police maintain the security net around the Capitol is not in response to any threat. Still to come on Channel 2's Weekend Report, a close call for firefighters keeping a roaring fire away from oil tanks in New Jersey, and mourners ask why a woman was shot down by police in her apartment. Those stories and more when we come back. Firefighters in Bayonne, New Jersey had a close call today as they battled a fire that threatened an oil tank storage yard. No one was injured in the blaze at the Garden State Container Company. That fire is under control, but still smoldering tonight. Channel 2's Carlos Amezcua reports.
It was giant rolls of paper used to make cardboard boxes that caught fire in the rear storage yard. Clouds of smoke billowed high into the clear sky as firefighters worked desperately to avert a potential disaster. What was of primary concern to fire officials was keeping one side of the fire cool, the side closest to the fuel storage tanks.
Well, you throw water streams on the tanks to protect it so that the radiated heat won't extend to that. And it'll blow up. That's the problem. So we managed to do that. We had a few explode. I think small propane tanks have exploded.
The brisk wind was carrying the flames away from the tanks holding explosive fuels and toward the Hess tanks holding number 7 fuel oil. Fire officials told us that oil has a high flash point, meaning it would have to get extremely hot before the oil would catch fire. The closest tank was a mere 20 feet away, and steam was clearly visible, indicating that the tank was in fact heating up. It was this kind of disaster that fire officials were trying to avert. In January of 1983, one man was killed as huge fuel tanks exploded at Texaco's Newark refinery. It took 36 firefighters and 2 fireboat crews to bring today's blaze under control.
We are in the rear with heavy streams, and the fire seems to be under control at this time.
Seems like a nasty, stubborn fire. Is it because of the rolls or what?
Right, it's difficult to put them out. I imagine we'll be here all day.
Lessons learned fighting the 1983 fire may have kept this incident from becoming a major disaster. Carlos Amezcua, Channel 2 News, Bayonne.
More than 30 people are homeless tonight after a fire tore through their Upper East Side apartment house, killing one man. Police say 40-year-old Patrick McLaughlin had a heart attack and died after seeing the smoke and flames on the floor below him. 8 people, including 3 firefighters and 2 members of an EMS crew, suffered minor injuries. Though the fire was confined to just 1 floor, all the building's residents were forced to relocate because the water and electricity had been knocked out. A 23-year-old Bronx man is in police custody tonight, charged with dragging a woman into Central Park, beating her, sexually assaulting her, and then chasing her as she ran naked, screaming for help. Police arrested Joseph Bellamy for the crime a short time later. Police say the woman was in a phone booth at 65th Street and Central Park West just before 7 this morning when Bellamy forced her into the park. He faces charges of sodomy, attempted rape, robbery, and assault. An elderly woman who was shot and killed by police this week was buried today. But it may take a while before the controversy over police use of deadly force in the case is put to rest. Channel 2's Lester Holt reports.
There will be investigations, procedural reviews, and perhaps changes. But all will come too late for the grieving relatives and friends of Eleanor Bumpers, who was shot to death Monday by police trying to evict her from her Bronx apartment. At her funeral this morning, Bumpers was portrayed as a victim of poverty, injustice, and brutality.
When she was confronted to protect her home, when she was confronted to stand for that was her, she decided that I'm going to make a statement.
We're too gun-ho lately, whatever the case may be. It's such a sad case.
There are as many questions about the circumstances which led to Eleanor Bumpers' death as there are about the shooting itself. Police say Bumpers, who they described as emotionally disturbed and potentially violent, was shotgunned to death as she lunged at a group of police officers with a 10-inch long knife in hand. The officers had come to evict her from the city-owned apartment for 5 months non-payment of rent. Police Commissioner Ward says the officers went by the book, but Ward says the book needs to be changed.
They did what the patrol guy says, and what we find is that the patrol guide now leaves the decision at the first-line supervisor's level, and I think that we need to raise that.
Mayor Koch yesterday ordered a complete review of the Bumpers case from all the city agencies involved. That review will include an examination of the events leading up to the eviction order. But one city official, City Clerk David Dinkins, thinks the conclusion of any review is already clear.
This was merely an eviction. She wasn't committing a crime, and if this is the best we can do in our civilized society, we are greatly wanting.
The shooting of Eleanor Bumpers has created unrest in parts of the black community. Those feelings summed up by Councilman Wendell Foster, who as a minister officiated at today's funeral.
You see, the problem that bothers us in the black community is that we always hear the same line: they follow proper police procedure. And then after that, they're going to study an issue to try and come up with a new procedure.
How long will political leaders sit silently by? How long will the people who are paid to protect us go on destroying us? How long? How long?
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
Lester Holt, Channel 2 News, the Bronx.
The Daily News in its Sunday editions reports housing court records show that Eleanor Bumpers was less than 1 month behind in her rent when eviction proceedings were initiated. Just ahead, the latest in Campaign 84, as Mondale and Reagan trade charges on the last weekend before election. And we'll have a campaign close-up of how the president's men are trying to win New York State. Stay with us.